The topic of today's dialogue is the future of the corporation, which is arguably a very challenging topic, which has become even more pressing in the light of the ongoing COVID crisis. And the order of presentations today is as follows. Colin Meyer will present the point first, which will be on the future of the corporation, the economics of purpose. Colin's point is based on a large research program that he has been developing in collaboration with the British Academy, and also with some support from SAMS, which is the Society for the Advancement of Management Studies, and it's also the governing body of JMS. And Colin will advocate a view of the corporation as a purpose-driven institution that can be, with appropriate reform, can be a vehicle for both economic and social prosperity. Jerry Davis will argue that purpose needs democracy. So in his counterpoint, he will emphasize the declining role of contemporary corporations, and he will argue that corporations need to develop both internal and external democracy. After these two opening positions, our discussants, Paul Collier and Jennifer Howard-Grenville, will provide their own reflections on the debate, and then we will open up for question and answers. In terms of your own interaction with the panelists, I would ask you to please post your comments or questions in the chat during the presentations, and the panelists and myself will handle the questions as we see fit. So we will either respond in the chat or maybe later in the debate. And then after the presentations are over, we'll be able to ask questions verbally, just by raising your hands. I would ask you to keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, but it would be nice if you keep your cameras on so that we could see each other and have more the feeling of a lively debate. And without further ado, I think I will just the floor to Colin for his point on the future of the corporation and the economics of purpose. Over to you, Colin, and welcome.
Corrado, thank you very much indeed. Failures of business are pervasive and growing. They range from the macro, such as the environment, inequality, and social exclusion, to the micro, such as VWs deliberately employing defeat devices in their vehicles to escape detection in emission tests, or Purdue farmers' deliberately aggressive campaign to promote the use of addictive opioids, resulting in 500,000 deaths from overdoses in the US between 1999 and 2019. And Carillion's deliberate policy of debt issuance to pay out dividends and executive remuneration, followed by compulsory liquidation with liabilities of £7 billion. In each of these cases, the fines, penalties, and compensation that resulted from them came nowhere near remedying or rectifying the incalculable damage that was done. All three cases illustrate what is sometimes termed the pathological nature of corporations. The conventional response to this is to make the penalties bigger, strengthen regulation, and nationalize. And each attempt at doing this reminds us of its limitations. The limitations on penalties that could be imposed on financial institutions for their egregious abuse during the financial crisis because of concerns about the effects of penalties increasing their financial instability. Or the regulatory lags that leave regulators ever further behind and at a growing informational disadvantage in relation to technological advances. Take the case brought by the Department of Justice against IBM in 1969, lasted 13 years, by which time half of IBM's products to which the investigation related no longer existed. Or the growing insignificance of tangible physical assets in relation to intangible assets that cannot be measured or regulated. Or the internationalization of corporate operations that make national regulators largely redundant. It's not just the rise of multinationals that's the problem, but the fact that such social networks as Facebook and LinkedIn are natural global monopolies. Markets fail, but so do governments with growing regularity. Relying on governments to reform global businesses in a world of polarization, populism, nationalism, etc., does not instill great confidence. We have, of course, already tried this in the era that preceded freedom of incorporation, when corporations were licensed by governments. That produced such admirable examples as the East India Company, whose rapacious behavior has been so vividly described by William Dalrymple, and the South Sea Company, that obviously originated the concept of a bubble. But governments do have a vital role to play in a context where the interests of governments in promoting the public good are not diametrically opposed to those of business solely concerned about making money. One of the most regularly observed determinants of economic and social prosperity is good government working in tandem with good business. Take the four Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan, or Japan, or the Nordic economies of Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. In each case, there are strong, productive relations between business and government. What is most damaging about the Friedman doctrine of there being one and only one social responsibility of business to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game is not that it's an incorrect description. On the contrary, it has regrettably become self-fulfilling, but that it creates an artificial and divisive barrier between business and government. Business is there to make money at a point where government tells them to stop it. There is no notion of business as having a role that goes beyond just making money. There's a presumption that business is both incapable and has no legitimate claim to think beyond making money to performing a positively beneficial role in society. Even worse, there's no limitation on how much damage business can inflict on society and the environment until their shareholders or regulators tell them to stop. No wonder business is perceived by many to be psychopathic when we instruct it to be so. But it's equally wrong to presume that this is how it has to be. The reason for being so confident about this assertion is that a corporation is an artificial construct. It's a product of the law. It can be designed as we wish it to be. What is required today is very different from what was appropriate in 1862 when the limited liability industry was created. So let's stop complaining about business as it is today and asserting that that is how it must be until we regulate and nationalize it out of existence. Let's start thinking about what we want business to be and how to make sure that it behaves that way. What we want business to do is blindingly obvious. We want it to help solve our problems in ways in which we as individuals are incapable of doing. That is exactly what a company, as its name suggests, is there to do. It's a collection of individuals who work in company to bring the skills and resources together required to solve problems that we as individuals, societies, and the natural world face. It has to do so in a particular form that is commercially viable, financially sustainable, and profitable. Otherwise, it can't function, persist, or attract the necessary financial resources. But it also has to derive its profits in a particular way that is not inflicting problems on other parties. That's precisely the failure of the examples I gave at the beginning. Environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, the VW emission scandals, the Purdue Pharma OxyContin scandal, and the Carillion collapse. In each case, companies have all profited immensely at the expense of others. They've engaged in wealth transfers, not wealth creation. So the purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. That's not vague or woolly. It's not charity or corporate social responsibility. It's about hard-nosed business. Can it be done? And can we be sure that companies will abide by it? The answer is, I believe, yes. It's a systems design problem. We've designed one system of business that is failing lamentably, and we need to redesign it in a form where it will succeed. There are four components of this system design. The first is law and regulation. The second is ownership and governance. The third is measurement, performance, and incentives. And the fourth is finance and investment. The law should require companies' fundamental reason for existence and being to produce profits from producing solutions, not problems, for individuals, societies, and the natural world. That should be their stated purpose and objective. Regulations should set out where that minimum dividing line between solutions and problems lie. The owners of companies should have responsibility for ensuring that that is what their companies do, as should the boards of firms. Companies should measure their performance against their success in delivering their purpose and account for the costs of correcting failures. They should award people in the organization on the basis of their success in contributing to the purpose. And they should be accountable to their stakeholders, such as their employees, on whom they depend for delivering their purpose, as well as to their shareholders. In other words, there's a central role for the state and regulation in establishing a common understanding of what the purpose of the business is, and for that purpose then to be the basis on which business engages with all its stakeholders, including its employees and shareholders. A common purpose of profiting from solving, not creating problems, is then hard-baked into the fabric of a company, its culture, incentives, reporting, accountability, not just something that's externally imposed by regulation from which the company then profits from avoiding. Not only is it clearly feasible to do this, it is being done. Well-known examples in the UK are employee-owned trusts, which are held in trust for the benefit of the future as well as current generations of employees, such as Erie, the engineering consultancy firm, Richer Sounds, which Julian Richer created, and the John Lewis Partnership. Larger cases are the industrial foundations of Denmark, Carlsberg, Møller Mærsk, and Novo Nordisk, which are owned by foundations that determine the company purposes and ensure they are delivered. Not only are these some of the most commercially successful companies in the world, but they are also some of the most socially beneficial and offer the opportunity of forming common partnerships with governments in solving the world's biggest problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was an extremely clear presentation. Colin reminded us of the reason for existence of corporations. I think is a very important point to make. And he also talked about the reforms that are needed in order to promote purposeful corporation. And you also gave some very nice examples of corporations that are driven by purpose in their practices. I'm sure that Jerry will certainly engage in a provocative dialogue with that. So Jerry, over to you now.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you, Colin, for writing such a lovely essay to respond to, and for your broader project with the British Academy. It's fun to be the token American on this panel, because I think this explains why I'm so cynical and explains why I'm a little skeptical of some of the optimism. I want to start by saying that I agree with Colin entirely about the diagnosis and where we need to end up. I think we are very much on the same page, in violent agreement on some of the issues with our current system. And to the extent that we disagree, it's really on what is the path that can get us to something better. And so that's somewhat what I want to focus on. And I'm going to open by saying something that I couldn't say when I was an associate dean, because it doesn't sound very polite, but when I went through the pathologies of Western societies to say, really, what's gone wrong in our world today, in every instance I could think of, you could point to corporations being at the scene of the crime, so to speak. So Colin mentioned Purdue Pharma and the opioid epidemic. 60,000 Americans a year die from drug overdoses. During the COVID year, 90,000 died. It is a trauma. The life expectancy of Americans has declined over the last 20 years because of an epidemic largely facilitated or caused by pharma companies. Big sugar makes us fat. You may have noticed that Americans are pretty big. 40% of Americans are clinically obese. 60% are overweight. I'm going to lay that in part at the foot of big sugar and processed food companies. Nicotine addiction had been eradicated largely among teenagers. Then along came Juul with its candy-flavored pods that it markets to teenagers through Cartoon Network and Nick Jr. Now 1 in 4 high school students has vaped in the last month. Big tech and the collapse of happiness, truth, and democracy. I think that one's largely self-explanatory. Every day on the way to work, I ride down Sand Hill Road, past some of the funders of the world that we're living in today. And as Colin mentioned, they are not the custodians of community and truth. They're not doing what we want to do. I think January 6th showed this in several ways. Big oil and the collapse of human civilization. Is this an overstatement? Not sure. Jen might go along with this one during her comment, but I think it's fair to say, if the big oil companies actually extract all of the assets that they have on their book and it is burned and their carbon goes into our atmosphere, we're all doomed. But to extend that a bit, even if we did not rely specifically on them, if economic activities yield atmospheric carbon dioxide that is an untaxed externality, then it seems to me that species extinction is almost inevitable. If companies don't pay for their carbon, any business that they do, you need to justify their use of carbon, or otherwise they're contributing to making us worse off. I saw this on September 9th. I moved to California to be at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences for this academic year. This was what the sky looked like on September 9th. Wildfires throughout California send soot into the air, and it created this cloud in the atmosphere hundreds of miles away that turned the sky orange. The birds didn't know it was daytime, and on September 9th, they literally didn't chirp or sing that day because of the wildfires created or pushed by climate change. And I want to say that where I'm anxious a bit about purpose is that corporate governance in a shareholder capitalism system is very, very strong. So to put it most firmly, listed corporations inevitably put share price first because of the many, many mechanisms of what we call corporate governance, so literature that Colin and I have both contributed to. So if you ask a finance professor, they will explain that shareholder value doesn't mean share price. It's an unobservable construct, and that share price is kind of a proxy for that. But in the real world, shareholder value means share price. It's the stuff that goes into my pension fund. And so in practice, creating shareholder value means increasing share price. And as 20 or more years of articles in the Journal of Financial Economics tell us, There are a lot of mechanisms out there that point corporations in the direction of share price. The US in particular has this matrix of institutions that force corporations and their managers to focus monomaniacally on share price. There's equity analysts who get paid for being more right. There are hedge funds that can become activists in the case of firms that don't increase their share price properly. State corporate law in the US orients firms towards shareholder value. Misguided boards of directors seem to believe that they're legally obligated to create shareholder value, even though all the smart kids know that they're not. They all act as if it's true that they're legally obligated towards the North Star of share price. Share-based compensation is a very powerful drug. When CEOs and other executives are paid based on share price options, it is not surprising that they will act in ways that influence share price. Ultimately, there's the market for corporate control. If corporations do not seek higher share price, do not seek a better valuation, they will be smacked down by the market for corporate control, including the activist hedge funds that Colin alluded to. And here's the shocking thing. Last year, 42% of the tech companies that went public in the US had dual class shares, giving the founders 10, 20, or more votes per share. Mark Zuckerberg controls 58% of the votes at Facebook. You might imagine that this allows him to actually make good on the corporation's mission to create greater community, or whatever their current mission is stated as, and yet they are monomaniacally oriented towards share price. Why is that? Because they recruit their highly paid employees with share option packages. So even though Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have to fear analysts or the market for corporate control, no one can fire Mark Zuckerberg. Nonetheless, the company is very oriented towards share price because that's the way they keep their employees on side. And so even though they might look like there's control in the hands of people with a higher mission, they still act like they're share price grubbing colleagues. And I think it's fair to say that investors hate companies that create jobs, that pay well, that engage in CSR. Their ideal is something like Nike with 2 actual employees, the CEO and the COO, and everyone else is contractors or vendors of some sort, and they have almost no assets. Well, this is tricky. How do you make companies like this behave? And one possibility is to get them to declare a purpose. And I love the optimism of purpose, but I'm anxious that it's not going to work. Certainly in the US context, it's very difficult. We had one certified B Corp listed in 2015, then it got acquired. Etsy listed in 2017, its investors balked. They fired the CEO and dropped their certified B Corp status in 2019. We now, as of the beginning of this year, we only had 2 listed corporations that were certified B corporations. They just don't seem to be able to survive. Now, my friend and co-author and former student, Chris Marquis, assures me that I'm getting this wrong, that we are on the verge of a whole lot of benefit or certified B corporations going public. And I just need to wait a little bit because they can survive. And I hope he's right. But Danone does not give me comfort that the markets will allow corporations to behave themselves. There's just so many forces that point them in the direction of the wrong-headed version of shareholder value. The way that I would convey this is that shareholder capitalism is like Lake Erie. This is a lake bordered by Ohio, Michigan, and Jen's home and native land of Ontario. And it is covered in green algae during the summer. It's this algal bloom that will not allow anything to survive. You can throw any kind of fish into Lake Erie and it will be polluted. It doesn't matter. Yes, you could throw in a porpoise, but even porpoise will not survive. All right, sorry about that. It's a dad joke. It's really hard to make it in Lake Erie because the ecosystem is so strong that it overcomes things. So what do? Can more democracy help? And here's where I have my own, maybe there's a pairing between corporate purpose and more democracy that might get us out of this pickle. So there's a rising movement against corporate power, and it's the damnedest thing in the US. Everyone now has a book on monopoly and antitrust or competition law. You know something is up when Josh Hawley, right-wing zealot who voted not to certify the election on January 6th, and Amy Klobuchar, liberal presidential candidate, both have books on breaking up big tech in the same week. You never see this kind of consensus around the pathology of corporations. And so there may be some hope for democracy from above. I am writing a book, though, arguing that antitrust or competition law really is not going to be sufficient to take this on. It's not a problem of competition. It's really a problem of shareholder capitalism from my perspective. But that's one thought. The other one that's a bit more novel is that maybe there's hope for democracy from below. We have seen in the last 3 years, tech workers and others forming movements within and across their corporations, demanding that the firms live up to their values. We saw employees at Salesforce.com saying, we don't want to do business with Customs and Border Protection. They're imprisoning toddlers on the Mexican border, and we don't want to do business with them. We saw Facebook workers saying, we don't think this president belongs on social media, and we don't want to give him a platform. Amazon workers saying, we don't want Amazon Web Services used by oil companies. And the thing is, these are workers with high levels of skill that cannot be easily replaced. If you can't keep your workers on site at Google or Facebook or Amazon or Salesforce or Microsoft, you're gonna have a really hard time doing your work because tangible assets are not what they do, as Colin highlighted in his lovely piece. Consumer boycotts mostly don't work in my experience. Every corporation is currently being boycotted. Nestle is always being boycotted. It doesn't seem to do that much to change them. But employee veto power can actually potentially make a difference. If you're interested in this, let me point you to democratizingwork.org. This is a wonderful recent movement among academics that came out of the COVID epidemic to try to create more democracy at work. So if you have a chance, visit this. The collaborators behind this have a new book out in French and coming out in Portuguese and English and elsewhere. And I think there might be some hope for democracy to be part of the cure of the issue that Colin and I both agree to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Fascinating counterpoint. And as I was expecting, you contrasted Colin's rather optimistic and hopeful view of the corporation with a kind of bleak picture of the American corporate world. And of course, your position have a lot of common ground, but there is some that is what point counterpoints are about. It's a more optimistic tone from Colin, who is an economist, more pessimistic tone from Jerry, who is a sociologist. And I'm now curious to hear the discussant's view on that, because again, we have an economist, an organization theorist, a European and an American. So let's spice up the debate. And Paul, over to you and welcome to this.
Clarifying that Jen is Canadian. We may look the same, but we are
I
different.
said American. What did I say? American, North America. Sorry, Jen.
Right, thank you. I should say I'm going to start from John Kay, who's a sort of pretty well-known business economist, and I have written this thing, Greed is Dead. What we mean by greed is dead is greed is no longer intellectually tenable. The principles that made it are no longer intellectually tenable, and that therefore, at the moment, we're in effect at peak greed. We're surely in a desperately greedy society, there's no doubt about that, but it's not a securely greedy society, because the lousy intellectual ideas that justified greed, including Friedman's, are just plain intellectually untenable now. We've learned a lot more. So the structure I'm going to take is, first, Jerry, I'm going to challenge you not initially for excess cynicism, though I'll get round to that, but for excess naivety. I think you are excessively and romantically naive about democracy. I've spent my working life on the interface between sort of democracy and society and economy, and I've become much more circumspect about this when democracy works. So I think you're naively optimistic about democracy, and the scholar I'm going to point to here is a political sociologist par excellence in North America, and that's Robert Putnam. So I'm going to base my, as it were, my Bible on democracy is going to be Putnam's latest book, The Upswing, and his thesis really is that to work, democracy needs to forge common purpose. That democracy is not just different interests shouting at each other with the majoritarian shout winning. It is a process which is fundamentally ethical about forging some common purpose. And so that brings purpose very firmly back in. And if you create an environment as toxic as Lake Erie, where purposes won't survive, democracy won't survive. It will malfunction, as American democracy so manifestly is malfunctioning at the moment. So much for your excess naivety. Let me turn now to your excess cynicism. And this is takes me back to the fundamental intellectual weaknesses of Friedman's doctrine of profit maximization. And fundamentally, where Friedman's wrong is his account of human nature. It is not just a very bleak account of human nature, it's a totally misleading one. It's a travesty of human nature based upon a misunderstanding by economists of what evolution was saying in the 1950s. The 1950s was peak Darwinism, crude Darwinism. The survival of the fit implied the survival of the shit, in summary, right? And we now know that that is just intellectual rubbish, right? If you go to the doyen of evolutionary biology now, it's a complete renunciation of that view of human nature. Humans are a mammal, and so we have a greedy, lazy, selfish component in our nature, like all other mammals, but we're an extraordinarily unusual mammal. We're very, very pro-social, far more pro-social than any other mammal. We bond in groups, we care about each other, we build mutuality, we are organized. Our primary organizational entity is not the individual, it's the network community. At Harvard, it's the head of the Department of Evolutionary Biology, Joe Henrich. In Yale, it's the head of evolutionary biology, Nicholas Christakis. Both major figures documenting just how extraordinarily pro-social humans are. So we're mammals, but very unusual mammals. What that tells us is that we can be dragged either down or up, depending upon the organizations in which we function. If we live in organizations designed for the survival of shits, then guess what? We'll be dragged down to the habits of shits, which is what lousy firms have done. If we're never going to be saints, but we are capable of much better than shittiness. And so a good organization, whether public or private, brings people up to the better angels of our nature, which is mutual support and building very complex commitments of mutuality. We see this, incidentally, in the response to COVID. Neither my country nor yours did at all well on COVID, but in Europe, by far the best country, both in terms of missing very low incidence of mortality and very low economic hit, is Denmark. And how did it do it? Because Denmark has repeatedly been good at building common purposes within a bonded society. And so the basic message in Denmark was, don't kill your neighbor, look after your neighbor. If you're an old guy like me, stay out of the way of the young so they can get on with their lives. If you're a young guy with kids, don't kill granny. You all have responsibility to avoid COVID. That completely worked. So that was success. It was built by a very good leader who was trusted. She was the communicator in chief for the society. If we look across at America, the onset of COVID, what struck me was those images of long queues outside gun shops. That's what you get, not exactly protect your neighbor, more shoot your neighbor, if you drag people down into a culture of individual selfishness. So that's the tragedy, but it's an avoidable tragedy. So finally, why do we not want to go the route that you suggest of representativeness, of representatives, and how do we build better? We don't want this screaming match of, think in Britain, we got health policy set by the trades union of doctors, and it's been scandalously bad. Scandalously bad. The trade union of doctors sets public policy on health for its own personal selfish interests. It's shameful what's happened in Britain. It's better than America. That's a very, very low benchmark to beat, right? We've got the health system of Eastern Europe, right? So we don't want representatives screaming my interest, right? What we need is to put the purpose at the level of the common purpose at the responsibility of all members of the board equally, so that the challenge of doing these trade-offs is taken by all members of the board. They own the problem and they have to reconcile with the purpose of the company, as Colin sets out, what that should be. Let me finally tell you how to test whether it's true or not. And this is, once you've got a stated purpose, is your incentive system for your staff aligned with that common purpose or not? If it's not aligned with the stated common purpose, then the stated common purpose is bullshit. And that's the problem you highlighted with Facebook. Whatever the nonsense stated purposes of its CEO, this actual stated purpose is as the incentives for the staff have been devised, which is maximize shareholder value, right? So that's a case where you can call the bluff of the bullshit by looking at whether the incentives for staff are properly aligned with the incentives, with the stated purpose of the company. Whether they're not aligned, that should become a criminal offense for which the board is liable. So the board becomes liable for the proper implementation of the stated purpose of the company. You can't get around purpose. But the good news is we're built as human beings to cope with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Incidentally, the message from the government here in the UK was protect the NHS. I don't know whether that worked or not.
It means protect the doctors.
It certainly didn't work during the first wave.
No.
Jen, to you,
Thank you so much.
the honor of completing this debate.
Yes, little did I realize that it would be raised that I was the token North American, and you all have it right, Jerry. I was wearing my Roots sweatshirt last night when we spoke, so I am Canadian. I also happen to be American. I was born in neither, and I'll let you guess where. So the Canadian in me fervently wants to believe in the position that we are pro-social beings, that we can simply work out this systems problem by declaring purpose and by having mechanisms in place to enforce that. The cynical American in me, even though I'm not, as Jerry puts in his essay, someone who has actually lived in the United States in 1920, which he declares is like binge watching an entire season of Black Mirror all day, every day. I haven't watched a single episode of Black Mirror, but I looked it up on the internet. So, so Jerry, I feel for you. And I also feel that that is a part of the cynicism, the pessimism we need to have here, because we're pro-social beings, but look where we are right now. I think the argument that we need to debunk the Friedman doctrine, you know, I've been in this business for close to 20 years now, and there's been a small cottage industry in academia, you know, looking at the Friedman doctrine from all sorts of perspectives, and I think we can move on. It's very clear that short-term and long-term shareholder value right now in this century, in this decade, is built upon completely different things from what the presumption was when he wrote, for a variety of reasons, not just theoretical, many practical. So I think that I would agree with Jerry that the two essays fervently agree on the problem, on the diagnosis. The question is what to do about it. And I think the first thing I will say, Jerry, you know, really, even though you've been in California for a year, it's really seeping in, because there are some positives that corporations have brought us. Even those big five that you say have, you know, are responsible for 22% of the market value right now in the S&P 500 that have produced all these evils, have also produced what you point to as the democracy sort of led movements, the ability for people to connect on social media and to raise questions to their firms and to demand different kinds of actions successfully would not be here without, you know, the Facebooks and the Microsofts, et cetera. I think we are very fortunate to be in a position where large listed corporations have brought us vaccinations in at a pace and at a scale that would not be possible. Yes, there was a huge amount of government assistance and intervention, but could governments have done that alone? So I think, Jerry, you know, come this side of the pond for a moment of optimism, and we do need to recognize the positives in terms of scope and scale, innovation that corporations bring us. So even though everyone seems to agree on you know, that it's not perfect, that there are significant issues, the route to get out of it is distinct. So as an organizational theorist, I think Jerry's ideas around employee-led movements are powerful and interesting. And I think what we've seen in this area is moving beyond employees demanding changes in, for example, their working conditions or their wages, to actually demanding that the moral compass of their organizations is altered in a way. Jerry has written about social entrepreneurship. I've written about issue selling, and you know, for years now, it's been something that has been seen as difficult for employees to raise issues that matter to them, to get them onto the corporate agenda, and particularly to get action on them. Again, this is changing, and it's in part changing because of social media. It's in part changing because of who we are as a society. And so I think that links to the point around, you know, can we all expect, with the declaration of corporate purpose and with mechanisms to enforce it through government, through markets, and maybe through employee voice, can we all expect ourselves to be so pro-social that it all works itself out? Can capitalism solve its own problems through capitalism? Just greater participation, greater attention. I would love to think that's possible. I would love to, but we are in a situation where we see democracies, political democracies around the world misfunction. The people who have voice within them, even formal voice, even the ability to voice, to have a vote, which let me remind you, is not assured. The ability to access and exercise that right to vote is not assured. And then the voice that actually gets exercised, who wins, whose voice gets heard and gets put on the agenda, both politically and in terms of corporations, is not equal. So we may be pro-social beings, but there are large swaths of the population who don't get spoken for. And those are humans, humans of color, women, people who are excluded traditionally from having a voice. And so I think when we reach a point when the purpose of corporations can be inclusive, it's going to be impossible to imagine it being so inclusive that everyone with every issue brings it forward to the hands and the feet of corporations to solve. And B, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that it's a perfectly oiled system, that there's no friction within it, that there's no power and interest that would play out. And I think when we move to other issues, Jerry mentioned climate change, and there's a huge amount of other lack of voice in terms of what oversees corporate action and corporate purpose, and that comes from nature itself. So Lake Erie, even if it has a porpoise, Jerry, can't speak for itself. So we, I think, are in a position where some of the solutions that have been proposed, like more control from above, like better measurement, like better yardsticks, are crucial, but I would argue insufficient, and still kind of perpetuate a very optimistic version of capitalism that I don't think we're quite ready for. I don't have alternatives, but I think we need to be really cautious in believing that purpose could solve it all. And I'll close with this one remaining point. As an organizational theorist, institutionalists have long always made us pay attention to what are the social norms of now, and how do they change? So what we might have pointed to in the past as being a sign of great progress and posterity, the industrial smokestacks in our community, are now seen as a source of pollution and even poisoning. So we need to keep in mind that no matter what the purpose is, no matter how it's enforced, how it's regulated, how it's enforced from the bottom up even, it's dynamic. And any system that we try to create, Colin is absolutely spot on in saying these are system problems. Any system that we try to create tends to have self-perpetuating tendencies. So how do we actually enable the changes in values, the changes in perspectives to come forward and actually create to a shift in the system rather than just get subsumed into the inertia that's already there? I think I'll stop there because I'd love to hear from the audience.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jen. And I think before passing the mic to the audience, maybe I'll pick on a couple of questions that are in the chat, and also linking to what Jen was saying. You basically were saying that individuals might be pro-social, but they are not equal, and that is problematic. And also, Tim here in the chat is raising an issue about being pro-social. So he says, even if humans are pro-social, why should we expect them to behave pro-socially if institutional forces, incentives that Jerry described push them down the shit? Why should we expect people to find common purpose? While it may be feasible in Denmark, can it be done in a more divided and heterogeneous country like the US? I would like to pose this question to Colin and Jerry, because then they also will have the opportunity to react to what the discussant said. So Colin, you are on mute, Colin.
So the issue that arises is, what is it that an organization like a corporation can do in terms of encouraging us to be more pro-social? And I think it's important to recognize that one key element that underlies the nature, not just of companies, but of all organizations, is their potential to create either what one might call saint-tegrity or sin-tegrity. In other words, they can either reinforce that notion of Homo economicus, that we are greedy, lazy, and selfish, and make us even more greedy, lazy, and selfish through providing the incentives in the organizations to do so. Or they can do exactly the opposite. And the first of those we observed in spades during the financial crisis. You know, it's not that bankers are inherently bad people. What many were finding themselves doing were behaving in financial institutions in ways in which they wouldn't have dreamed of behaving in their own family circumstances. And conversely, what we observe in the most impressive organizations is that people recognize their pro-sociality through engaging with each other in rallying around the common purpose of the organization. And so the cases that I was referring to, for example, in relation to the industrial foundations in Denmark, are ones where the organization is structured in such a way to do that. And really the problem that I think exists with the way in which much of this debate is framed is that we start off from the notion of ideologies. You know, that's what's dominated discussions about business for centuries. The ideologies of the right, that it's all about property rights and preservation of property rights, and a company is just a property of its shareholders, and that's what it's structured to do, and we need to protect that. To the left, which says it's not the property of any individuals, it's the property of society, that society creates the corporation, and therefore the societies have a right to oversee and control corporations in one form or another. Now, that's just the wrong way to frame the debate. And it doesn't get us anywhere, and it hasn't got us anywhere in those hundreds of years from which that debate has emanated. We need to start at the other end. And that's the thing that I'm really emphasizing. What do we want to do? What is the organization we want to create? And think about how you structure it in such a way that it delivers it. And if you start from that point of view, you recognize that there are some elements of the right which are important. Of course, property matters. You know, people have capital, which is very important to embody in companies so that they can grow and have a real influence. But so too is the observation that they have to have an objective that is aligned with trying to solve the problems of societies and the natural world. And that needs to then be the starting point from which one tries to design the organization one wants to construct. And unless you do that, you'll never get to where you want to be.
Thank you, Colin. Jerry?
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this. This has been great fun. I do feel I should take a minute or two to respond to Paul's commentary, since it was very thoughtful. I am often accused of excess cynicism, but rarely of naivety. So that's good fun. The point about democracy, and this links to some of the comments that we've seen, is that the transaction costs for engaging in democracy are much, much lower now. The technologies that enable communities to collaborate with each other, to create Linux or to work from home. We have the technology in place that could enable organizations to be much more democratic from a grassroots level. People select themselves in to go work at Facebook or Salesforce or Kroger or Marks and Spencer. So they've joined that community voluntarily. They could be entrained into being more good at democracy. That the idea that we only participate in democracy in this desultory fashion every 4 or 2 years at the ballot box in the US case, that seems crazy. We could be engaged in democracy on a daily basis. We could be exercising those muscles. We could be engaging in habermastication. Let's chew things over and have some thoughts about things like purpose. Why leave that to the board of directors? Why leave that to the CEO like Mark Zuckerberg? It seems to me that if you want to create a purpose, make that a democratic process and give people more talent and more ability to exercise their democratic muscles. We could be voting right now. We could be taking rank order voting on restaurants to go to at lunch. We could have democracy suffused throughout the organization, and it'll make us better citizens. We will take those things that we learn at work and bring them out into the broader world. So a more democratic workplace, I think, is just good all the way around. I'm sorry to hear that Paul's years of studying democracy have made him distrust it, because I'm kind of a fan. I've seen some reason to be slightly more hopeful in the last few months. I'd love to bring that into the organization level. And it is the case that the Friedman and followers have a pretty lame sense of how evolution works and what people are programmed for. It really isn't survival of the fittest. It really is the case that we were built for collaboration, but that collaboration can take some pretty negative forms when it takes the form of, say, xenophobia, hatred of foreigners, hatred of people in outgroups. If you're one party or another, hatred of that other party. That can be a basis of collaboration, but it's not something that we want to build in. We are hardwired to eat sweet things. And if you're living in a rainforest, that's probably going to be fine. If you're surrounded by sugar, that's probably going to be difficult. You can eat sugar by the pound and it won't be healthy for you. So I don't think we can take our evolutionary nature as the final word about these things. I would say Colin and Paul both pointed to exemplars from other places. And some people in the commentary have been asking about Denmark and its sort of peculiar system. So love Denmark, would love to see a Novo Nordisk in every country. But as Colin points out, this is a systems design problem, and institutional transference is hard. We'd all be better people, I'm sure, if we worked at Novo Nordisk, but Novo Nordisk is not going to survive everywhere on Earth. Chocolate is delicious, but you can't grow cacao in Canada. No matter how hard you try, it's really not going to work there. You need a broader ecosystem to support the creation of organizations that live in this way. And so if we want to do systems design, as I think we do, we don't want to pull out atypical exemplars from ecosystems that look very little like the English-speaking shareholder value-oriented world. I think it's, Denmark rocks, would love to see more Denmarks, but for us to move in that direction and to have organizations that look like Danish organizations, you're going to need to change an awful lot of the levers that organizations build on.
Thank you, Jerry. I see there are other questions in the chat, which I would be happy to synthesize and relate to our panelists. But before doing that, if anyone wants to ask questions verbally, or maybe just verbalize one of their own questions in the chat, happy to do that. I don't see any hands up, but Dirk, Hakim, do you want to maybe pose your questions directly to the audience, to the panelists?
Yeah, I guess I can say it verbally. They were basically just clarification questions. I think Jerry has partially already covered my first question, so I was just curious what exactly he meant by democracy. Initially, he just talked about worker movements, and then I think afterwards, Paul seemed to assume that he meant worker representation on the board, which afterwards now he clarified he didn't mean. And so the other open question was to Paul, where I wanted to, I'm sorry, now my talk is getting involved. So the question to Paul was about who would be the board members who decide on the common purpose. Then there wouldn't be union reps, I guess. So, in Germany, we have union reps on the board, and it's a corporatist system that didn't prevent the diesel scandal at Volkswagen. Just curious who those board members are.
Paul?
Yeah, do you want me to come in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. My point is that I don't really favor this sort of representation approach to the board. I want every board member to face the same responsibility, which is the enforcement of the stated purpose of the company. And that becomes the legal liability of all the board members. And having a stated purpose becomes a legal requirement of a board. And therefore, if the board is manifestly not incentivizing its employees in a way that fulfills that stated purpose, that is a failure of the board for which it should be legally liable. So that you've got the purpose owned by the members of the board, regardless of who they are. Now, I think just to go back to Jerry's point about why he's naive about democracy, is that two things. One is that the very manifestation of Trump was due to a failure of democracy. This occurred after all the technology, but Trump still won. Why did he win? Because huge swathes of people had been underrepresented, which is to say, the less educated and the people from nowhere places. Exactly the same group in Britain that mutinied. Instead of Trump, it was Brexit. And obviously, these mutinies were captured by idiot populists, and so were disastrous. But it was the manifestation of a complete failure of democracy, despite all the damn technology. So it was those mutinies happened during long after the age of social media had already started. And I noticed that you completely ducked Robert Putnam's point. And Robert Putnam's point in the upswing is that America itself used to be able to do this much better. America's never been perfect, never will be, but it used to be able to do it much better. The upswing, he's got a wonderful opening. You read it as a terrible description of what's going on in America in 2020. And you get a little bit bored because you want to say to Robert, actually, I know what a mess America is in 2020. And then he says, I'm describing America in 1900. And the point was that the upswing happened because America managed to build out of that damn mess. America managed to create a much better effort at common purpose, which was far from perfect and still excluded some groups, but was a far better effort than had been in 1900. And Putnam is saying that process of forging common purpose, of expecting everybody, putting people in an environment where it's easier for them to be the moral entities that Colin has described, that was what America has shown itself of capable of doing. Why, if you're utterly pessimistic about that happening, why on earth do you think democracy is going to work in America? It's the very failure of democracy that is the cause of the problem of your cynicism about capitalism. Capitalism just replicates the larger failures of the society. Thanks.
Okay, I see that Javier has his hand up, but before that, I just wanted to extend the question that Hakim posed by involving Jennifer. And maybe Jennifer, you could also address the question that Jagdeep has put in the chat. So Jagdeep said, if good citizenship, for example, sustainability is critical to business purpose of creating value, why are so few businesses paying attention? So why are companies not behaving according to purpose if they if they think that it is so important.
Thank you, Jagdeep. I mean, I think more and more are, but as Jerry points out, they get slapped down. So we've talked incessantly about this being a systems problem, and then we say, look at the exceptionalism of Denmark. Well, Denmark and actually, you know, the supply chains that supply Danish manufactured goods are global, and we are in a massive system that actually has over time become more and more lacking in transparency, more and more lacking in the ability for even the most benevolent boards, leaders, and strongest incentive systems to actually know what the goods, bads, and otherwises are of any corporation. So I think it's incredibly naive for us to believe that we could impose this requirement for a purpose. Yes, that would be probably an incremental move forward. But the idea that we could then enforce purpose and make sure only good and no bad is done is incredibly naive. We all know that there are trade-offs, and we all know that the system that we're currently in, which is globally interconnected, has huge amounts of lack of transparency. So even the most benevolent leaders trying to create the perfect company doing good, and we have many examples of these. So to get to Jagdeep's point, Jerry refers to it in his article. Danone is probably the best known corporation which became a B Corp, and recently its CEO was ousted by activist hedge funds because not to do with it being a B Corp and having a social purpose, apparently, but to do with financial performance. So the system slaps down the incentive. There's a recent piece of work in Academy of Management Journal by Marc Desjardins and co-authors that Jerry also mentions. They have studied activist hedge funds and looking at 506 incidences of accident hedge funds attacks in the US between 2000 and 2016, they find that corporations have on average a 3% likelihood of being attacked by an activist hedge fund. If they are leaders in CSR, that almost doubles to about 5%. So you stick your neck out too far in the system and you get slapped down, and also believing that you can be the Denmark in a sea of non-Denmarks, or be the Danish corporate form in a completely different institutional environment is to ignore everything we know about institutions and systems.
Thank you, Jennifer. There is a live question from Javier. So Javier, over to you for your question.
Yes, hello. Although I would also mention that I believe Dick Martin had his hand up, so I will wave to him if he wants, but otherwise he perhaps
okay,
can go after me.
Dirk, or yeah.
My comment is more directed towards how we address these questions as scholars. I think I really miss a stronger understanding of the firm's political nature as such. I think Colin's solution very much, at least your first 2 points, were looking at regulation. I think workers' democracy in Jerry's presentation pointed in that direction. The problem I see, though, is that we have very crude notions of what democracy or what the corporation as a polity looks like. And that depends very much on our notions of what democracy is. I think we need to open up to a new discipline, and management has done that in the past, and we are at a threshold to making that other step. In that sense, I was delighted to see Paul on the panel here. I think that's the direction we need to go. There are different ways and different ideas of what democracy actually means, what a functioning polity is, how these processes work, what that includes. And I don't want to go into detail, but I think we need to further open up and don't consider that as a discipline that talks about different things. Corporations in themselves are political and are part of the solution rather than waiting for the outside, for the so-called democratic system of traditional politics to solve anything. I don't wait for that to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. I'll take that as a comment maybe, and then we take Javier's question, and maybe we can combine the two points. Javier?
All right. Yes, thank you. my point is a bit different, but perhaps there is indeed a combination. I was taken by Paul's comment about the power of potentially making directors liable. But I'd like to take this one step further and get the reaction of really all the panelists on the issue of limited liability, pertaining in this case, not just to the employees, but also to the shareholders. I believe today's debate has pertained to a corporate form that's barely 200, strictly speaking, 210 years old, less than that in the UK. The PLC, the incorporated company, and whatever its version is in my country, the BV, are relatively new forms which existence on some level is not a given, and which have been to a certain extent superseded. At least Jerry has, I believe, argued that or provided evidence to that effect by non-listed companies, but also by forms of effectively non-limited liability companies. So I'd like to get the reaction of the panel to the question of whether removing the limitations to liability on the shareholder side could be part of this debate.
Okay, thank you. I think we could go to Colin and Jerry, so you could maybe address this question as well. Maybe Dirk comment on the meaning of democracy and the political nature of the corporation. Colin, would you like to go first?
Yes, I think that what Dirk was putting forward is very much along the lines of what both Paul and I are advocating. And that is that one needs to think about the nature of the corporation in a more imaginative way in terms of development of systems of inclusion and democratization that go beyond what we think about in relation to the ballot box, but also what we think about in relation to current notions of what accountability in business is. And the starting point of this is there isn't a right solution. The reason why a corporation is potentially so powerful in this context is that they all have different purposes. They all should have different purposes. Some are very innovative, some are very traditional. Some need large amounts of capital, some need far more in the way of human resources than financial capital. And therefore, the nature of the governance and accountability of organizations should be markedly different. And yet what we do is we try to impose a uniform structure which currently basically puts all of the control and oversight in the hands of one party at the expense of another, without thinking about, well, what is best suited for a particular organization? And if one thinks about it in these terms of allowing businesses to design the nature of engagement of other parties for that which is best suited to their purposes, then you create a much richer notion of what business is, and one that can think about its participation in society much more generally, in terms of, for example, thinking about how it does forge partnerships with governments at national or local levels to solve problems that arise in those particular contexts. So that idea that Dirk was putting forward of let's try and conceive of business in richer ways than the very mundane forms in which they're currently conceived is, to my mind, a very powerful point. On the point that Javier was raising about the nature of limited liability and whether if we eliminated limited liability, would that solve our problems? Well, first of all, he's absolutely right to point to the importance of this move towards privatizing publicly listed companies. The number of listed companies in Britain has halved over the last 20 years, and it halved over the previous 20 years. And similar things have been observed in the United States. Companies are literally voting with their feet because the way in which they're being imposed upon in terms of the governance arrangements undermine their operations. So that's a manifestation of the problem. Is it solved through introducing unlimited liability? The answer is no, it's not solved simply by doing that. Why? Because the nature of the inclusion of capital markets in companies and their ability to raise finance from capital markets depends on the ability of people to be able to trade their shares. You cannot simply eliminate that as being a component of it. But on the other hand, you have to then think about, well, how do you overcome the clear deficiencies associated with a system in which companies can simply run away from their liabilities? And that's where this notion of accountability of directors for upholding their purposes is extremely important. And that's where one has to build in the incentive arrangements to give rise to a far better alignment. And the notion of having directors liable for failures to implement what they say they're doing is key to that. And so it's not simply a matter of saying, take away limited liability and problems will be solved, but thinking about how does one combine the real benefits associated with financial markets with what one wants companies to do.
Thank you, Colin. Jerry, and then I think we should have time for one very final round with all the panelists. Jerry?
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you. So Javier, thank you for the question. I agree with Mayor on Colin on this. I understand limited liability to be a purely financial device that says that as a shareholder, you can't come to my house and cart away my furniture when we go into bankruptcy. So it doesn't mean that you can get away with anything because you have limited liability. So I don't think that's it'll help much. You'll have a hard time finding investors if you don't have limited liability, including pensioners such as me in the not too distant future. I agree that with I think what I understand Dirk to be saying, that we need to be thinking about the political ecosystem that incubates corporations and their responsibilities. I pasted in the chat a recent paper I published called Varieties of Uberization, that looked at how the ride-hailing industry, the basic idea of riders and drivers with GPS-enabled smartphones connecting, how that very simple idea that can be stated in a sentence varies pretty radically around the world. We look at Nigeria, Sweden, Germany, US, China, Indonesia, India, and it turns out that simple implementation is realized in very different ways around the world, and we attribute it to the nature of their institutional ecosystem. You allude to social welfare provision, education. I'd say basically that the nature of a country's markets for capital, for labor, supply, distribution, how they manage internally, all of those things shape what a corporation can and will look like. Colin alluded to corporations vanishing from the markets in the US and the UK. My last book, of course, was called The Vanishing American Corporation, and started with that observation about there being half as many corporations in 2011 as there were in 1997, and I unpack why that is. It is not consolidation, and it is mostly not companies going private. The corporation is the public corporation is an increasingly economically unviable way of doing business in many kinds of industries. Germany has 600 public corporations today, and they did in 1990. You only have a public corporation under some pretty specific circumstances in Germany, partly because the Aktiengesellschaft has a lot of constraints on the people who run it. So I think we're heading in a similar direction in the US and the UK, that the public corporation is going to be taking on a fairly specific flavor of economic activity. If we want to reform the economy, we need to be thinking as well about private equity and other forms of enterprise. But broader than that, I think we do need to think about the variety of capitalism that we're operating in. How is it that the institutional ecosystem enables some kinds of enterprises and not others? And I'm still optimistic about democracy.
Thank you, Jerry. So we are nearing to a close, and I think we have time for one last round, and I've just been given permission to overrun slightly. So there are a couple of interesting questions in the chat, which we can use as a way of closing. One question is by David, who is asking. He said, you know, if we talk about system, we must discuss capitalism, and of course, Paul is an expert on that. And capitalism as the system that has given us both prosperity and peril. So that was one question. Another question was about the release of patents of vaccines. So Joe Biden has recently suggested that pharmaceutical companies should release the patents for vaccines. I think he has also proposed in recent times the establishment of a global corporate tax. So I think these two topics are quite interesting, and I'm going to suggest that each of you maybe either address this question or maybe offer a closing remark, maybe 1 minute or two for each. So shall we start with Colin?
So Milton Friedman has said at least some things which are very sensible. And one of those is that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that change occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. It's therefore our duty, he said, for us to develop new ideas, keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Now that's exactly what his other statement, the Friedman Doctrine, has got us to the point of needing to do with great urgency. And the real issue is, how many more crises do we have to go through before we recognize that we better sort out the mess that he's created by rethinking the nature of the corporation, if we're to avoid going through repeated crises of the sort that we've just witnessed. And that, to my mind, is at the heart of the sorts of issues, Gerardo, that you've just raised in relation to those questions about patents and coronavirus, about corporation tax, about the nature of our capitalist system. We certainly have a system of patents that has immense problems associated with it. It's not just to do with the coronavirus. It's a mechanism that is fundamentally flawed in terms of the nature of the inclusivity that it encourages and access to medicines around the world. It needs to be fixed. And one of the great advantages of what I'm talking about is it provides a way, and I talk about it in my article, it provides a way of thinking about how to solve exactly that type of problem so that we don't go through the type of debacle that we've observed during this crisis. And the same goes in terms of the nature of taxation. It is appalling that the fiduciary duties of directors under current law are to minimize the payments that they make in the form of their contributions in terms of tax. In other words, they should abrogate their responsibilities as contributing to the societies in which they operate as far as possible. That is simply just a nonsense of the way in which we structured our businesses, and we need to sort that out in terms of the future of the corporation. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much. Jerry, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll be brief because we are already at time, but I think questions about reforming the corporation are well and good. So in the US, we do not have a monarch, unlike the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I do worry a bit that reforming the corporation is a bit like trying to reform royal families in Europe. I mean, they still exist. Denmark's got one, and I think the Netherlands has a queen or some damn thing, but mostly they don't matter that much. They're a bit of a sideshow. So if we're thinking about the future, maybe we should not be bound by the corporation as the dominant vehicle that it was for much of the 20th century. If they're disappearing, if transaction costs favor more impromptu forms of collective action, then maybe instead of fixing the old things as they're dying, maybe we should be thinking about this new system enabled by the kind of technologies that we have currently that enable much more sort of ephemeral or impromptu ways of collective action, and thinking about what are going to be the anchors that hold communities together and that provide the benefits that we want of economic security, mobility, the ability to live the lives that we want to.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. So I want to first pick up on liability. And the liability we need is indeed liability of company directors. I recommended a system called bank slaughter, which would create a criminal offense of basically negligently in charge of a bank, which did not have to prove intent. I mean, that's the distinction between between manslaughter and murder, right? You don't, to be convicted of manslaughter, you don't have to prove an intention to kill. Right? And so we need that sort of liability, but it has to be personal on directors, so that a director who's found guilty of misaligning a company with its purpose can be dragged off the golf course into jail, not a fine. A fine is paid by company shareholders who have no power. It's the company director that has to be liable for jail. That's the liability that would radically change corporate behavior, radically. So that's one point. My last point is that Gerhard Grenfell described a cottage industry of challenging the greedy purpose of corporations. This is a sort of trivial little thing. This is not a cottage industry anymore, Jen. I don't know where you've been. There is a tidal wave of rethinking by major intellectuals. John Kay and Mervyn King in Britain, Radical Uncertainty. These are not trivial people. These were the apex of the economics profession in Britain. They renounced the whole idea of profit maximization as a valid purpose. Michael Sandel, the most widely rated philosopher in the whole world, The Tyranny of Merit. Robert Putnam, the most revered political scientist in the world. Upswing, which Jerry carefully ignores. Wherever we look, Rebecca Henderson, Harvard's top-paid professor, reimagining capitalism in a world on fire. Rajan at the Holy of Holies in Chicago. Wherever we look, there is a massive tidal wave of rethinking. As I said, Henrik in Harvard, Christakis in Yale. This is happening in an unprecedented way for the major intellectual figures. I've only described the social sciences. Exactly the same thing is going on in the hard sciences with the same intellectual revolution. This is a battle that is going to be fought out across both the social sciences and the hard sciences, and it's no longer a cottage industry. Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick question of Paul here? So you are proposing that directors who fail to create incentive systems that orient firms toward purpose will be arrested on the golf course and imprisoned. I want to make sure I got that right.
They will be liable personally liable, right? And in egregious cases where they result in mass deaths, as in the drug industry and addiction, they will be jailed, yes. Why not? You defending them?
Well, you said that they would be liable for failing to align the incentive system with corporate purpose, which seems like a much lower standard than causing the deaths of people. So,
and the extent to which it is egregious will depend upon the nature of the penalty exacted. That doesn't seem so complicated, does it? With bank slaughter, it was because of the concept of deaths, avoidable deaths, which is a very pertinent point, as you know, from America's drug industry. Some people should be jailed for what they did in America's drug industry. They killed a lot of people.
Thank you, Paul. Jan, you have been evoked in Paul's final comment, so
Sure.
the final comment is for you.
Final, I'll make it really quick. I think I was misunderstood on cottage industry. I've been a management scholar for more than 20 years, and we have leading management scholars. I know Rebecca Henderson well, and all of the other people you've invoked. It's fantastic to see them joining this conversation. And those of us who have been part of the conversation have been talking about the Friedman doctrine for the same amount of time. My claim was merely to say we need to stop talking to each other. I think we've all convinced each other of the importance of taking seriously what's actually going on in the world, which is a massive shift. And I think I would love to see a situation that Colin describes where organizational forms are designed around purpose. Right now, we have very few organizational forms. Jerry points out things are shifting, but they're not shifting in a way that is necessarily unique to purpose and that is going to deliver on purpose. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could design organizations and the systems they operate in to deliver purpose? Instead, what we have, as most management theorists would agree, is a very small number of organizational forms basically founded around mimicry and fitting to the institutional context, so they can be regarded as legitimate. So I come back to the point about who is judging, whose value are we delivering, whose purpose are we delivering? If we can find a way, and I want to end on a note of hope, if we can find hope in the next generation who will no longer work for corporations or buy from corporations that do not meet certain standards, that do not align with their values or their aspirations, I think we will see this moving in a direction that hopefully will pick up momentum and deliver the kind of world that I think we all agree we aspire to have for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating debate. And I would like to thank, first of all of the panelists for their very generous contributions. I also want to especially thank Joe Chiseldin from our JMS team for helping, for supporting us in putting together this event. Please join us again for the next JMS dialogues, which will probably be in the fall, I guess. Most importantly, continue to support JMS. Remember that you can